Today I have for you one of the most complex and beautiful chess games that I have ever seen. It features what is probably the most famous opening novelty of all time, the Marshall attack, played by none other than its innovator, Frank Marshall himself. He's up against the great Cuban genius and future world champion, Jose Raul Capablanca, who, showing no signs of fear or intimidation, and with absolute faith in his own abilities, flawlessly navigated a hellish nightmare of complications. The result was an incredible demonstration of the power of intuition in a position that Capablanca apparently didn't even fully understand, as you'll see. So let's go ahead and get into this game. It's a wild ride. The year is 1918. The place is the Manhattan Chess Club in New York. Capablanca, playing white, opens the game with e4, which is followed by the highly recognizable sequence of moves known as the Ruy Lopez. As famous in 1918 as it is today, but Frank Marshall is about to do something with the black pieces that is not recognizable at all. And that moment arrives after the move c3, played by Capablanca, going for the ideal pawn duo with no clue of what was about to hit him, which was the bold, daring, and brand new pawn sacrifice, d5, which has since become known as the Marshall attack or the Marshall gambit, and it's an opening that I personally hate playing against. And if you've ever faced this opening yourself with the white pieces, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, well, you're about to see why. Nowadays, a lot of players, including myself, will try to discourage this gambit by playing moves like a4 or the move I like, h3, instead of c3, after which black can still play his d5, but it's not as good, and we will talk about why. But back in 1918, this came as a total surprise, not only to Capablanca, but to the entire chess world as well. This gambit had actually been played before, but never at the highest level, where it was virtually unknown. Now, legend has it that Marshall had been studying this opening novelty for 8 years, waiting for the right moment to play it. I don't know if that's true, it's been disputed, but at any rate, Capablanca knew that after he played e takes d5 and Marshall recaptured on d5, if he were to now collect his pawn on e5, Marshall would subject him to what Capablanca himself described as a terrific attack, all the lines of which would of necessity be familiar to my opponent. So Capablanca knew what he was getting himself into, but he said that his lust for battle had been aroused. He felt honor-bound to take the pawn, and he believed that his position would be defensible. So, what a warrior, sticking to his principles, trusting his gut when it tells him that white's best move is to take the pawn, and then going all in with knight takes e5. Now, what's interesting is that while this has been regarded as sort of a suspicious way for black to play for a lot of years, it's actually preferred by modern-day engines, including Stockfish, which considers it black's best line. So you got to hand it to Marshall for being the first elite player to discover this, even though in 1918 he really didn't know how to handle the rest of the opening, as we're going to see. Okay, so here we go. Knight takes e5, rook takes e5, attacking the knight on d5, to which Marshall responded, knight to f6, a move that we now know is inferior to black's strongest move, which is c6. And this is a move that was eventually introduced by Marshall himself. So why is the c6 move better? Well, the idea is that after d4 and bishop to d6, driving the rook back, black can bring his queen into the action with queen to h4. This wouldn't be possible if the knight was sitting on f6. And I should point out here that if white had played h3, like we talked about earlier, instead of c3, then this move would not come with the threat of queen takes h2. Also, you would have the c3 square for your knight. So you'd play knight to c3 instead of d4. That's one of the anti-Marshall lines, as they're called. But what you see here is the most popular line in the Marshall today that many of you will recognize, with g3, since queen to h2 is threatened, and then queen to h3, bishop e3, bishop to g4, etc. So this is known as the most dangerous way for black to play, getting full compensation for the pawn, and with correct play from both sides, the game should end in a draw. But back in 1918, Marshall figured that his move, knight to f6, offered him the best prospects. It does come with the threat of bishop to d6, followed by the sacrifice on h2, and then knight g4 check, queen h4. This is a very well-known motif. So Capablanca, seeing that bishop to d6 was next, preemptively moves the rook back to e1, and we do have bishop to d6, threatening that sack on h2, which Capablanca defends with h3. d4 would have actually been stronger, But Capablanca didn't want the knight to get to g4. Although Stockfish isn't worried about it, saying you can respond h3, and even though queen to h4 is coming next, white should be fine. But I'm not going to get too deep into this line because we're going to see something very similar to this happen in the game. So we had h3 from Capablanca, and what do you think Marshall does here? Well, he plays knight to g4 anyway, which is pretty, but it's not accurate. And this sort of marks the beginning of the end for Marshall. Though it's far from obvious, his best move would have been bishop to b7. Then he'd have the bishop pair pointing at the king side, a little lead in development. White would still be better, but that was his best chance. But after knight to g4, Capablanca, running on pure intuition, correctly assesses that he should not capture the knight, and instead plays the top engine move, queen to f3. And the reason I say it's pure intuition is that the variation that he later gave as proof that you can't take the knight is wrong. So let's see what Capablanca was afraid of here. After h takes g4, there'd be queen to h4, threatening to come into h2, and if you tried g3, the bishop would just sack and you'd be finished. But white is losing here no matter what he plays. The line Capablanca gave as losing for white in his subsequent analysis began with the move queen to f3. But then instead of the winning bishop to h2 check, followed by bishop takes g4, Capablanca said black should play queen to h2 check, which actually throws away the win. After king to f1, black can still draw with queen to h1, followed by rook to e8, when white has some counter threats to f7, the rook on a8 is hit. But Capablanca's big idea in this position was bishop takes g4, a blunder which hands the win over to white after queen takes g4, queen to h1 check, king goes to e2, rook a to e8 check. And you might feel inclined to agree with Capablanca here. Kind of looks like white is going to lose this rook on e1. After the king moves, the rook will take, and then your bishop on c1's under fire. What do you do? Well, incredibly, white is actually the winning side here. And there's only one move that will save the day. See if you can spot it. How does white win? In 3, 2, 1. Bishop to e6, blocking the check. And if rook takes e6, you simply take with the queen. Beautiful, and completely overlooked by Capablanca in his analysis of this game. But it didn't matter, because a player of his caliber, of which there have been very few in the whole history of chess, they can just feel their way forward. Sometimes they just know what to do, even when their calculations are wrong. So what do you think would have happened if Capablanca had calculated this variation correctly during the game? Do you think he would have taken that knight on g4, assuming this variation was the best black had? Or do you think he would have kept searching until he discovered black's actual winning line, beginning with that move bishop to h2? How many of you have been in a similar situation where you were tempted to play a move, but you just had a feeling there had to be something wrong with it? So you decide you're going to keep looking until you find a way to prove what you already know. Or maybe you just trust your instincts and move on. If it turns out you were right, is that luck? Is it intuition? Well, whatever it is, it's what compelled Capablanca in this position to play queen to f3, leaving that knight alone, eyeing f7, eyeing the rook on a8, adding defense to f2, a very strong move, maybe best. d4 was also good. We have queen to h4 from Marshall, with the counterattack on f2, so there's no time to be grabbing the rook on a8. Still no good for white to take on g4, so Capablanca instead plays d4, it's the strongest move, activating his dark squared bishop, with the possibility now of playing bishop to e3 to block the e-file, which is significant in some lines where the king gets driven over this direction. And here Marshall's best move would have been h5, supporting the knight, so that if it's captured, then after queen to h2 check, you're going to recapture with the bishop supported by a pawn. After which white would still be better, but black would have some chances. But Marshall decided to try this move, knight takes f2, which is very tricky, but totally losing. It does come with the threat to take on h3 with check. Now Capablanca could just capture the knight with queen takes f2. It's not the best, but let me just show you this line so you can see just how crazy some of the variations lurking under the surface of this game are. Black should play bishop to h2 check. Can't take the bishop or you're losing the queen. So king to f1, now bishop to g3, and after queen to d2, you're not taking the rook on e1 because that would lose. Instead, you play bishop to f5. Now the threat is to take on e1. If the queen recaptures, then you get bishop to d3 check, and that will win the queen, driving the king away from the defense of the queen on e1. So what white should play here is rook to e3. We have rook a to e8. These are all engine moves. It says you got to play queen to e2. And there are some important variations I'm skipping here, but to fully understand this game is well beyond the scope of this video. It's just so ridiculously complicated. But let me just show you this. Black plays queen to f4 check, king goes to g1, and now a spectacular move, bishop to d3. After which white needs to play queen to f3 with a better position, though not clearly winning, and black's attack will rage on. But let me just show you what happens if the queen captures on d3. There would follow a mate in 4. Pause the video and try to work it out if you'd like, but here it comes in 3, 2, 1. Queen to f2 check, the king goes to h1, and now queen to e1 check. And after rook takes e1, rook takes e1 check, you can only play queen to f1, and now rook takes f1 is mate. So just one example of the crazy underlying complexity present in this game. It really makes you wonder just how much of this was calculated by Capablanca. How did he know this line was inferior to what he played in the game? In this position, where he declined capturing the knight, instead, once again playing the best move in the position, rook to e2, which also leads to extreme complexity, but somehow Capablanca knew this was the way to go. Bishop to g4, now played by Marshall, who is totally losing at this point, but Capablanca has to be very accurate, and it's time to capture one of these minor pieces. But which one, the knight or the bishop? It might be tempting to try queen takes f2, challenging the black queen, so there's no time for bishop takes e2 here, but there is time for bishop to g3. And if the queen moves, then there's bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, the rook comes to e8, with a big problem on e1 if the queen moves. So you got to block with bishop to e3, but then there's queen to e4, pinning and winning. So Capablanca apparently saw enough of this line to realize that in this position, he's got to capture that bishop with h takes g4, allowing the very frightening, although completely harmless, bishop to h2 check. And after king to f1, black could play knight to h1 here, headed for g3. It wasn't played in the game, but it's just another scary looking move that Capablanca would have had to know couldn't hurt him when he took that bishop on g4. So I'll let you take a look at that line on your own if you want to, but I'm going to continue with the game here. We have bishop to g3, defending the knight, threatening queen to h1 checkmate, so the knight is captured with rook to f2. Here comes the queen with check, king goes to e2, and now Marshall has the choice of taking the rook on f2 or the bishop on c1. With the idea of queen takes b2 check, picking up the rook. In both lines, black's going to win a rook, but it's not going to be enough. Marshall chooses bishop takes f2. Capablanca moves his bishop to safety. Marshall does the same. And now Capablanca, who at this point only has 2 minor pieces for the rook, with his king in the center, doesn't try to run to d3, which is winning and probably what I would want to play, but instead plays the very bold and very crushing queen to h3, hitting the queen, hitting the bishop, but allowing the rook to get to e8 with check. King goes to d3. He's going to hide on c2. We have queen to f1 check. King goes to c2. The bishop gets out of danger with bishop to f2. Now queen to f3 pins the bishop, so queen to g1 unpins. And here Capablanca is a bit up in material, but he's in an awkward position. He'd love to complete his queenside development, but his knight on b1 is pinned to the rook. So he goes about activating that rook the only way he can, starting with another top engine move, bishop to d5, preparing b4, followed by a4. Not afraid to push pawns in the vicinity of his king. We have c5. Marshall naturally wants to eliminate as much pawn cover in front of the white king as he can. The pawns are traded, and then we have b4, hitting the bishop, which drops back to d6. Now a4. Capablanca is going to open this a file, activate the rook, and he's not intimidated at all by Marshall's attempt to complicate things with a5. And doesn't this just look like something a computer would do with the white pieces? Just relentlessly trusting in its flawless evaluation, which is saying that despite all these pawns which are about to get traded in front of my king, I have foreseen that I am in no danger, and I will continue with a takes b5. played by Capablanca, and after a takes b4, white can actually get away with capturing the pawn on b4, but Capablanca says, I think I'll keep that c-file closed for the moment, and goes for an equally crushing move, rook to a6. Hitting the bishop, we have the pawn capture on c3. Capablanca finally completes his development on move 32 with knight takes c3. Now bishop to b4, getting that bishop out of danger, desperately trying to make something happen, planning bishop takes c3, but it's to no avail because here comes the b-pawn. We have the trade, bishop takes c3, and now Marshall plays h6. He wants to play rook to c3, but he knows that if he were to try that immediately without giving his king a square, like so, then he would get brutally mated with queen takes f7 check, rook takes f7, rook to a8 check, rook to e8, rook takes e8 is checkmate. Hence his move h6, but Capablanca has no fear of rook to e3. He just pushes that b-pawn one step closer, as sung by Christina Perri in one of the greatest chess songs ever written. Here comes rook to e3, but this unfortunately walks right into a forced checkmate in 6 moves, despite Marshall having given his king that h7 square. So pause the video if you want to try to work it out, but here it comes in 3, 2, 1. Bishop takes f7 check, played by Capablanca, was enough to convince Frank Marshall in this position to resign. He saw the writing on the wall, the forced mate, which black cannot escape, even if he plays king to h7, as this would run into queen to f5 check, and after king to h8, the rook's going to take on h6, since this g-pawn would be pinned. And if instead rook takes f7, there of course follows the queening of the pawn with check, and after king to h7, there'll be rook takes h6 check, king takes h6, queen to h8 check, king to g5, or to g6, doesn't matter, because queen to h5 is next with checkmate. And so we see the inevitable conclusion of Capablanca's near miraculous combination of intuition and calculation that allowed him to prevail in the face of an enormous disadvantage, up against a brand new and extremely dangerous opening novelty sprung on him by one of the greatest tacticians of all time, Frank Marshall, who had months, if not years, to study its intricacies. Under such circumstances, this masterpiece played by Capablanca with virtually flawless precision must go down as one of the greatest achievements in the whole history of chess. So thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed this, and I will see you soon.